Welcome back to Between Two Racks with the Kilo Crew. This week's episode, we're going to discuss speed strength. So, let's kick it. Speed strength. So, I know this is something, Steph, you are very passionate about. You really enjoy discussing teaching speed strength. But I also know that when you go down the rabbit hole, you can often get frustrated a lot of times with the terminology that's used among different people in the research and everything. But before we dive into all of the components that make up speed strength, I do want our listeners to understand that speed strength and power are the same. They can be used interchangeably.
Kind of, up to a certain point, yeah.
Because I know when we called our class speed strength for, we always go back and forth between speed strength and power. And then we ended settling on power because more people know of power versus speed strength. So I know you just said that kind of, sort of, they are the same thing. So what makes them different?
I mean, it's very subtle. It's just that, and I'll expand on this after, but it's just that, so speed strength at the base, at least what I'm using from the literature, is the combination of three elements, which is explosive strength, starting strength, and reactive strength. But technically speaking, and I'm being very technical, power per se is mostly reflected by the combination of starting strength and explosive strength.
Okay.
Reactive strength, it's not to say it doesn't have impact on power development, but scientifically speaking, it's not necessarily part of the power equation because power has more to do with rate of force development, which is mostly developed with starting strength and explosive strength. But again, it's not to say that reactive strength does not improve rate of force development, which is why it gets somewhat confusing. But I think what I want to say about all of this and why it becomes frustrating is because of my age. When I was first introduced to the concept of power development, most of the authors in the field and most of the science, at least when I was at university in the late 90s and reading books from Gilles Cometti and reading the European Journal of, I'm forgetting the title, but all these journals and all that research and most of the books back then, whenever it came to speed strength, they say that it's a term that the European coined, which is mostly a literal translation of Russian literature. But speed strength was viewed as power training, and speed strength was exposed as explosive strength, starting strength, and reactive strength. So that was my upbringing. That's what I started with. And then as I move on through continuing education, and in 2001, I did some Ian King courses, and then in 2002 or 3, started with Charles Poliquin. They were also using these terms because most of Charles's influence, Schmidt-Bleicher and the Germans and the Swedes, and they all use these terms. But the problem, the way I see it now, because scientific research has evolved, because now there's more technical gadgets, there's more technology that they can use in research. They establish, and that comes from Bosco actually, but they established a much wider range of power component. So if you look at Bosco's speed continuum, there's a lot of steps. There's what they call absolute strength, what we call limit strength. Then there's maximal strength. then there's acceleration strength, then there's strength speed, then there's speed strength, then there's starting strength, then there's reactive strength. So there's a bunch of subdivision across the continuum, but the reason why they were able to divide that continuum in so many different pieces is because the technology and research from Carmelo Busco allowed, because of the technology, to differentiate all of these parts. But not even that much, because in actuality, Busco was unable to determine.
Yeah. So the speed, or the strength speed and the speed strength zone, for a long time were considered the undefined or undistinguishable zone.
Yeah.
And then it took like a new level of technology to come in before they could ever actually differentiate between those two qualities.
And then when you're talking about this continuum and you're saying how then they further broke it down, you're talking with these technologies that they're identifying like a speed at like the movements, which are then categorizing them into these different categories?
Yeah, but that came a little later. But they were just, because back then they used to use like machines, like fixed machines, and they would calculate the angular velocity speed. So that's how they determined these things. The velocity came later, like late 90s, in meters per second. But anyway, so they were able to subdivide that continuum in so many categories. But my problem is nowadays you speak to any younger strength coach and they're using this, and it's fine, it's great, but they're using this for training purposes, and this is where I don't like.
Versus like research purposes, you're saying?
Yes, because when you're actually in the weight room, when you're a real coach in the weight room.
Yeah.
And I grew up as a coach in an era where, I mean, midpoint through my career, Tendo units started coming out. And I've never had one. So like I was forced to basically use coach's eye to determine the velocity and which category of training, of power I was in. But the reason why I like the old school, which is why our first power course, I wanted to name it Speed Strength. It was more like a ode to the old timers, but it's just like it was not popular because it's not as well known, and most recent coaches perceive speed strength as the old school general term, which is more power. They perceived it as this like slight subdivision of the full blast continuum that you see nowadays. So it seems a little weird to have a course on that little short subdivision.
I wonder if there would have been more than just pork that would have come to that course.
Technically, that was power course.
By him, it was power. But the thing is, when you look at the continuum, the way we do it and the way I learned it back in the days, where you have maximal strength, explosive strength, starting strength, and reactive strength. Now it's not as involving. It's way easier when you're training your athlete to quantify or qualify where that lift fits in.
Yeah.
Okay, because it's not the ranges are not so narrow that you might be, is that strength speed or is this speed strength? Is that acceleration or is that strength speed? So that to me, it's overkill. I understand for research purposes, and then in books they show like Super Training, they showcase it this way, but Super Training it's a science-y book.
Yep.
So it's just funny to me that now coaches that are on the field are going to use that continuum to gauge their training. It's too detailed for the reality of true coaching.
They don't need to.
They don't need to. So that's why. And sometimes people might feel that we're not up to the latest in science, but it's not the case. It's simply a choice that we made because we believe in the simplicity of coaching, and we believe that a strength coach should learn to be a coach without necessarily needing a bazillion gadget when they're coaching. It's fine at a certain point, right? You work with Olympic teams, like you have a sports science guys on your team, fine. But if you're a one-on-one coach in a private sector training your athletes, simplify things.
Yeah, because it's really easy to make sure you're increasing the velocity demands of a certain quality. So say we're training or explosive strength, we can choose a exercise modality that is naturally slightly lower velocity to start with, and then later in the phase choose an exercise modality that is higher in velocity just by nature. So like it could be accommodating resistance versus the ballistic. Like we're obviously going to be moving down the force velocity curve just by going between those two different modalities, but while still training in the explosive strength zone. So it can happen very naturally just with the right choice of modality without having to measure every single moment.
Yeah, especially if you're a strength coach in a team setting. Like how many? I mean, we know a lot of strength coaches in the collegiate. They don't have any, like they hardly have any equipment, so they're definitely not like spending money on all that technology.
The equipment is very
stuff.
reliable either, so you still want to be able to fall back on your ability to coach.
But to go along with your point, though, and I don't want to talk about this right now, but I will. But there is also a huge flaws in gauging your training with meters per second only.
Yep.
Okay, but I kind of lost my train of thought here with what I was talking about, but to get back to the speed strength as the general concept of power. Oh yeah, so that's why old school strength coach like Ian King, for example, is a big proponent of the simplicity of power training to the point where he doesn't even worry about starting strength, explosive strength, reactive strength. To him, it's more like it's more power, and it's more like fast power, slow power, or light power, heavy power. Like he tries to simplify it even more, and then reactive strength, he just calls it like stretch shortening cycle or plyometrics, which is what it is. And then you even have exercise scientists like Tudor Bompa, who's also a huge proponent of, hey, let's simplify this. We have max strength, we have power, we have stretch shortening cycle. We're coaches, let's not overcomplicate it. So that's why, to me, I'm bothered when I see that like huge continuum and people adhering to it so much. Now, before I talk about the velocity, I just want to define for those who don't know the 3 parts of speed strength as we teach it. So explosive strength. So, okay, let's backtrack. So that continuum, it starts with the heaviest, slowest concentric action, which would be maximal strength. Which is the section on that really well-defined continuum you see nowadays. That's what they call absolute strength. Okay, but absolute strength to me is very misleading because absolute strength also means a strength quality relative to body weight, which is ability to develop strength irrespective of your body weight. So it gets tricky. So if you just say absolute strength, wait, are you talking about like the type of strength the O-line in football needs, or are you talking about max strength? Mm-hmm. So why not use the terms like how they should be used? So from 100% of 1 RM, which is the heaviest, slowest concentric possible, all the way down to 80% of 1 RM, that's generally accepted that this is the maximal strength zone. Now, from 80% all the way down to 30 or 20% of 1 RM, depending on the source, this would be your speed strength zone. But speed strength as a general term, like the European said, for power, not speed strength, which is that small subsection of 30 to 50% in the more current continuum. Okay? And then finally, you have like pure speed, which is like
sprinting,
body weight, sprinting, whatever. Okay. Now, in that speed strength window, the heaviest, slowest is explosive strength. Generally speaking, if we look at Busco's work and stuff, we're talking about anywhere from 50 to 70 or 80% if it's Olympic lift variation. Yeah. It can go down to 40% depending on the source again.
Yeah.
Then we have starting strength that, according to Busco at least, it's 20% all the way up to 40%. But then we're talking about elite athletes. Okay, so then you have to take this into account where you're training like amateur athlete or gen pup. Okay, and then you have reactive strength, which is body weight up to 20% of 1RM if you're doing like some type of loaded jumps and stuff like that. Okay, so this is the continuum as we know it. And then explosive strength, it's your ability to keep exerting force in a linear fashion through a concentric action. Okay, so you're doing a bench press. So from the bottom all the way up, it's the ability you have to keep generating more and more and more force to have more and more speed as you keep extending. Starting strength is your ability to generate force in the early stage of that concentric action. So starting strength, typically, if we look at Schmidt-Bleicher's work, is accomplished within the first 50 millisecond of concentric action. So it's a very quick, very short time frame to actually exhibit starting strength. So the only way you can really do true starting strength is at very light loads. Okay, so that's why Busco's talking about 20% of 1RM.
Is that like the 1-inch punch?
Yeah, so Bruce Lee's 1-inch punch is the perfect example of starting strength. So in other words, starting strength would be your ability to go from 0 to 100, your ability to overcome inertia. So something that's immovable, you want to make it move, but it's very early stage, which is why a heavy deadlift is technically not starting strength. Although you're trying to overcome inertia, but it's not starting strength because the load is so high that by the time you're able to move the load, because you start the lift, your force is spiking up and up and up and up. But by the time you're generating enough force to actually move the weight, you're past that 50 millisecond window. So you're actually not working starting strength. Starting strength is extremely neural. Starting strength is your ability to recruit as many motor units as possible in the early stages so you can displace the load at extremely high force and speed from the get-go. Okay, and what's interesting is if you really look at it like precisely, starting strength is a component of explosive strength. It's basically the start of the movement. Yeah. And so that's why rate of force development is explosive strength heavy combined with starting strength. And then finally, you have reactive strength, which now reactive strength is not a concentric only endeavor. It's basically your ability to use kinetic energy built during the eccentric contraction and your ability to quickly transfer that kinetic energy into a forceful concentric action. So it's a different skill set to the point that some almost view it as not a part of speed strength. So that's why I was saying speed strength and power are kind of interchangeable, but not fully because of that reactive strength aspect.
But you said, so I just have a question. You said with the explosive strength, it's the heaviest, slowest. And then you said with the starting strength, like you don't train starting strength with heavy weights.
No.
But then you said that the beginning of an explosive strength is starting strength.
Well, because any explosive strength movement, you need to start the lift.
Yes.
Okay. So in order to become better at explosive strength, eventually you need to become better at starting strength, which is trained lighter, but simply to learn the skill to recruit more motor units. So like young coaches, you need to understand that an athlete never really, unless you're an early stage athlete, you don't get better playing the game. You get better practicing the sport. So look at starting strength the same way. In order to improve my ability to be more forceful in explosive strength, You need to train the component of the beginning of your explosive strength as a standalone unit sometimes with lightweight through pure starting strength endeavor, so you can actually teach the brain to recruit more motor units really, really, really quickly. Once you train that skill at lighter weights and you've developed the ability to recruit more motor units, now if you add more weight in the explosive strength type exercise, now you will have learned to be able to access more motor units early, which will allow you to displace more load at the same speed you did previously on the explosive strength movement.
Yeah.
So
Sorry. And you'll never truly train starting strength to its fullest capacity just through explosive strength movements, because you got the eccentric preload in most explosive strength movements. So you're going to have the help of the kinetic energy stored within the eccentric and the stored elastic energy in the stretch shortening cycle. So without negating that and truly training just starting strength, it'll never be developed to its full capacity.
Yeah.
It's the easiest way to think.
Because starting strength is the only of the three modalities that needs to be trained from a dead stop. That's the only way you're going to develop that skill.
Correct me if I'm wrong in that example, but let's say you're training Olympic lifting. So this is why Olympic lifters don't always just train the maximal weight that they can. They also do a lot of reps at a lighter load so that they can learn to be faster. No.
Well, that there's more for explosive strength, not for starting strength, because even no matter what they're lifting, it's going to be too heavy for starting strength.
Yeah.
Even when they do light.
Yeah.
Well, because they don't do because if you look at the two lift in the Olympic lifting competition, the snatch and the pull and the clean, okay, it seems like they're lifting from a dead stop, right? Because the barbell's on the ground, they need to pull the barbell from the ground, but it's not starting strength, because if you look at the greatest weightlifters in the world, the first pull from the floor up to the knees, it's somewhat slow. Okay? They're basically building up force potential, but you're in a such bad lever in order to create acceleration that they actually wait until you're at about knee level to now really explode off of that position. So Olympic lifting is purely explosive strength. When they train at lighter weights, which is never 20%, be like 50 to 60, it's mostly to build technical skill on the lift. So it's technique rehearsal, because don't forget, it's a sport, right? It's like when baseball players just throw the ball like very lightly. They're just, practicing their throwing motion, but there's nothing to it. So like a perfect example of a starting strength exercise we would do with athletes is you're sitting on a box, you're counting to, let's say, 4, and then without any preload, because you're sitting on a box, without rocking your torso back and forth, you go from that position, and then you try to, with your brain, to have so much intent, and boom, you jump and explode from that position. There's zero preload. It's purely starting strength, because the weight to overcome is not extreme. It's only your body weight. You're in a position of leverage. You're sitting with knees at 90 degrees. And then you have, because there's no preload, you're forced to recruit as many motor units as you can in the prime mover to displace that movement. So it's a completely different skill. But it's to the point that certain authors, speed strength is only 2 quality. It's explosive strength, and like even what's his name, the ex-British track coach,
James Wild.
James Wild, for him, speed strength, it's explosive strength and reactive strength. But explosive strength is subdivided in 2 subcategories, which is starting strength and acceleration strength, which is actually a pretty accurate way of presenting it, because the starting strength is the start. Okay, you teach the brain to recruit more motor units to start the movement in the early stage. But then what do you do after? You try to work on acceleration. But when you take both components together, you become very explosive. Okay, so Yeah.
Okay. Do you have something else you want to say, or do you want me?
Well,
to...
then I wanted to go to the velocity thing.
He's on a roll.
Like with rate of force development, is that what you're going to talk about now?
No, but I can talk about rate of force development.
Just overarching velocities. Is that what
Yeah,
you're-
but
okay.
I'll talk about RFD first, then I'll talk about the velocity. So,
Like I said, Steph is very passionate about this topic.
well, because it's so, like, if you're a training athlete, it's so important.
Yeah.
But, and it's so not taught in, like, if you do any personal trainer or strength coach certification, even back in, like, the reason why I became so passionate about this is because after all of my learning with Poliquin and PICP, after even being a PICP level 5, I still felt like I knew nothing about power development. It's not a thing that in most certification, it's not taught that much. Okay. So
because everyone's confused.
So I personally needed, it's really 2013, 2014-ish that I really dug deep into it to make sense of all of this because it was so confusing. But anyway, so rate of force development. So when you're doing a concentric action, power is a direct correlation with the nervous system's ability to generate force at a high level very quickly. So that's the rate of force development. So how fast can you develop force to move a weight really, really quickly? And how you train RFD is with explosive strength and starting strength. Now, always work on explosive strength first. And then once you acquire a certain skill with explosive strength, move on to starting strength. Starting strength is way more complex, way more neural. There's no point trying to work that component if you have zero base in explosive strength. But they're both intertwined and they both affect your ability to generate force quickly to move weight fast. So that's RFD. And RFD is probably the most important skill to have for most team sports athlete. Now, the velocity. It's really cool. Like we use output. We like output. It's a velocity tracker that's very versatile. And it's really cool because as opposed to back when I was a coach where I was using coach's eyes all the time, now we have actual feedback. That's not abstract. It's actual feedback with a speed. So let's say we're working at 60% of 1RM on bench press with chains. And I'm telling the athlete, hey, we're working on explosive strength. I want you to displace that weight as fast as you can. And I want every rep to be high quality. So let's say we're doing 4 reps, and then he's pushing these 4 reps at, I don't know, 0.8 meters per second on average. And there is not a big drop off. It's pretty much all around within a 7-10% window. So now it's cool. Each rep was high quality. Now, the next session, because that's the problem, you don't necessarily want to just, it's unlike standard strength training, next session, you're not necessarily automatically increasing the weight by 2% because you don't know if you're increasing the weight by 2%, will he be able to overcome that load and be as fast, or will he slow down? Because you definitely don't want him to slow down because the skill we're trying to work is speed.
Well, and isn't it almost more the goal would just be to try to increase the speed versus focusing on the weight?
100%. So if you're doing a 3-week meso, you start at 60% of 1RM with chains week 1. So let's say he's displacing at 0.8 on average. Okay, so the mean velocity for the 6 sets, let's say, was 0.8 meters per second. Week 2, keep the same weight, but now you're trying to beat that. Maybe 0.82, 0.83, whatever. Okay, but at least you have this to track and make sure of. Now, where Porik and I are not fan of using the velocity trackers is using the velocity trackers to target which of the multiple quality of the newer continuum that we're talking about you're going to train. So to say that, okay, we're working on starting strength, so you need to be at 1.3 meters per second or more. We're working strength speed, so you need to be at
0.75 to 1 strength speed. So
0.75 to 1, and then speed strength is 1 to 1.3.
So the zones are maximal strength or absolute strength is pretty much from 0 velocity to 0.5. Then acceleration strength, if we're going to break it down as much as that, is 0.5 to 0.75. So if we're just considering it as explosive strength, you could start at 0.5. Then strength speed is 0.75 to 1. 1 meters per second is supposedly that maximum power zone. Then from 1 meter per second to 1.3 is speed strength. And then 1.3 to 1.6, I want to say, or 1.5 is starting strength.
Yeah, depends.
It gets a little funky there.
Yeah.
But all that, it's all...
And then reactive, it's 2.5 and up.
Yeah, and it's all somewhat grey because the way that those velocities were actually determined is somewhat flawed, because what the study they did, they used the squat, the bench press, and the deadlift. And then when they looked at all the data, the bench press didn't correlate, so they dropped the bench press and just used the squat and the deadlift. So it doesn't actually have the same carryover that people associate it with. So if you're doing it on upper body movements especially, you're not going to achieve the same velocities with the same percentages you will as the lower body. And it's mostly due to you're moving the load less distance, so your average meters per second is going to be lower because you don't have the same displacement. The same distance to displace at higher and higher velocities.
Exactly. So that's why we're not fans of using the velocity to guide which quality you're training, because it's too inaccurate. If you're doing back squat and deadlift, fine, because these are the only two lifts that correlated to these ranges. But if you're a O-line with a big barrel chest and short arms, and the distance you're covering on bench press is like 1 foot, and you want to work starting strength, forget it. You're going to be using such light weight, you're going to blow your elbows.
So before we move on, so are you saying that we don't like using that? We prefer to use certain techniques to...
Like the percentages?
So between techniques and the percentages associated with those techniques,
okay,
and then validate the improvement on a session to session or intra-session with the velocities. So, okay, we're going to use accommodating resistance. We're going to use anywhere between 50 and 70% in the really high end.
Before we start saying the specialty techniques, I just want to go back one more time to what you're saying, but instead of specialty techniques, still doing it as the explosive strength, starting strength, reactive strength.
Okay, yeah, but the problem with that is it's going to be different depending on which technique it is.
Okay.
But saying we're working on the heavier end of explosive strength, and we're going to prescribe roughly a 60% barbell weight. We can maintain that 60% for all 3 weeks and just use, no matter what the velocity was, just use the velocity to make sure there is an improvement on a week-to-week basis, and we don't fall underneath the critical drop-off zone of power work, which is anywhere between 5, 7, or 10%, depending on where within the season or what your goals are. So there's how we like to use it, instead of saying, okay, we want you to lift this load at 0.75 to 0.8, and it's this tiny zone. Yeah. And it gets funky because
it's too inaccurate, because that's the problem. Like, as strength and conditioning coach training team sports athlete, there's too wide an array of movement that we're training to be able to use these velocity zones with accuracy. Like, with just injured clients, we wouldn't even train the quality that we think we're training. So instead, you use Bosco's percentages as your starting point. Mm-hmm. And then you use the velocity tracker to track the speed, but it doesn't matter. Like, we don't care. Like, we tell the athlete, hey, be as fast as you can. I don't care. Like, we're using the percentage we're supposed to for the quality we're trying to train. But then, depending on your range of motion, depending on your ability, the speed will be what it is. But the velocity tracker is great because now we use this to now progress.
And that's one distinction away from what most times you see people talking about this sort of work, it's in relation to powerlifting, especially when it comes to accommodating resistance. And you'll see that there's a 3-week wave of increasing barbell loads within that 3 weeks. And that's cool if your outcome you're looking is maximal strength. But since the outcome we're looking is to increase velocity and force output at higher velocities, we don't need that increase in load on a week-to-week basis if we can move the same load at higher velocities. That is the quality that we're trying to train. So it's somewhat of a difference than what most people will read when they look up this style of training, because most of it's written from the powerlifting perspective.
Because like at the purest essence, power, true power, is your ability to displace on a compound movement 50% of your 1RM as fast as possible with as much weight as you can. So if year one, athlete X bench presses 100 kilos at 50% of 1RM in 0.7 meters per second, but then with training year 4, that same athlete now is displacing 200 kilos at 0.7 meters per second, you know damn well that athlete now is significantly more powerful. So that's the essence of power training, and that's why we use speed strain the way we do it, and that's why we use the velocity tracker the way we do it.
And athletes are so competitive. I think just knowing how fast, like I just think back when we were in St. Louis and we didn't have any velocity trackers. Like imagine if you could have just told them, okay, we're going to keep the same weight. You're just going to try to go faster. Because it's one thing to say to someone to go faster and then for them to see the numbers. I'm like, it would have been cool to see.
We were so limited by technology and equipment in St. Louis with these athletes that's why one of my favorite speed strength exercise for lower body was the broad jump and the med ball toss.
Yeah, because they were measurable.
Because it was the only thing, because we didn't even have anything to measure vertical displacement. So it was the only way we could actually have a measure. Yeah. And then if you do it in groups, it's even better because of that competitive edge. You know, they're trying to beat the other one's distance.
Yeah, and just
go with Alex's point, like they've done studies into that, and the feedback intra-set and inter-set with velocities has a massive improvement on their ability.
So on a practical standpoint for our listeners and coaches, I know you've touched on it a few times, but why do you find it so important to train speed strength?
I mean, with Gen Pop, it's not. With Gen Pop, it's more of a fun change of pace, improving neural factors, whatever. But for athlete, why? Because that's what sports is. Like, I'm sure everyone has heard the saying in sports, speed kills. So everything we're doing as strength conditioning coach with athletes is to ultimately make them more powerful via increase in rate of force development. But the only way you can really push rate of force development is by building first an adequate base in maximal strength, which prior to this, you need an adequate base in hypertrophy. So it starts with hypertrophy, maximal strength follows. Once you have an adequate level of maximal strength, and that depends on the strength reserve and blah, 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 then you need to move on to power training, which now is your speed strength modalities. And you need to account for the 3 facets of speed strength to have that overall development and neural skill so that RFD and stretch shortening cycle can be optimized for the performance of the sport. Because that's all sport. Like if you're a wide receiver and you're in your stance on the line, and you got the corner like 5 feet away from you, well, your ability to generate space for a quarterback to throw the ball to you and you catching the ball and explode away for a touchdown is purely rate of force development. how from that position can you create as much separation as you can really quick. It's all speed. That's all power related.
And no matter how slow your sport is, every sport, it's still the fastest who wins. Like even if you're doing, marathons or long distance and all that, like the faster you are, the better you will be at your sport. So any sport needs to do
but
it.
then you still have I'm sorry I cut you off, but you still have the nuances of eventually once you build the base, then you have the nuances of the position.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So for example, the lineman, when it comes to speed strength, reactive strength, whatever, it's never going to be a big thing. You need some, but it's going to be mostly like high-end explosive strength work. Whereas a cornerback, reactive strength will probably be the biggest skill. But you only start specializing with these things once you've reached a certain level.
Yeah, like the funny thing is in the gym, the only thing that really has transfer to the sport is the power. Like that's the only thing you really have a transfer to the sport. But to leverage power, you need maximal strength. To truly optimally leverage your ability to create more and more power, you need high levels of maximum strength. To truly maximize your high levels of maximum strength, you need the hypertrophy base. So like while this power that everyone wants to train because it's the fun thing, it's not overly taxing on a output perspective. Like it's neurally taxing, but you don't feel beat up after it.
Yeah.
That's what everyone wants to train, but they're skipping the two steps that's really going to leverage how much potential they have in their overall power development by skipping through the hypertrophy and the maximum strength.
Well, I know you've said it on another episode, and it's so true, and that goes directly into what you're saying, is if you're weak and fast, that's not good.
That is the biggest recipe for injury.
Yeah, so that's why you need the hypertrophy, you need the maximal strength development, and then you can work on the power. But if you're weak and then you start working on the power, not to say that you won't get a little bit more power, you're not optimizing what you're getting from it, but then that is not safe for the athletes.
Yeah, being able to create a lot of velocity without any function of being able to control that velocity is a nightmare for injury perspectives.
I'll give you guys a real life example of what kind of triggered me to being more curious about all this stuff. It's like I was fortunate to train many athletes for very long periods of time, and the best example is Steven Jackson, which I've trained his entire pro career from the age of 21 till he retired. What was interesting with him is he came in at 21 years of age into the gym. I assess him. He was a first round pick, like I think 24th overall, something like that. First round pick, super talented. But him, after assessing him, I'm like, wow, he's weak, he's big, but it was kind of like that quote unquote like useless hypertrophy, if you want.
It's just so untrained.
Yeah. So the first year or two, it was mostly hypertrophy work. Then it evolved to strength work. But then by the time he was, I'll always remember this. And that, like, he was 27 years old that time. And this is typically for a running back, and that's your prime. At that time, during the off-season assessment, my God, wow, like, he was a beast, man. Like, that off-season, he was 6'2", 254 pounds, 6.8% body fat on calipers. It was just a beast. But his max strength level was really, really high. It's like it was way above our typical standards. But my problem at the time with my education, like Charles Poliquin being my mentor, most of Charles' stuff is very hypertrophy and max strength bias. And the extent of power work was mostly like IMCA and Olympic lifting. So it was always like, it was like max strength with intent or Olympic lifting, which is high load, slow velocity, explosive strength. But Steven was a running back, and now he's 27 at the prime of his career, strong as hell, super muscular. But I felt like I was lacking the tools and the knowledge and the skill set as a trainer to what do I do now? Because now, like, RFD and speed is really what we need to focus on now. So that's why I got really, really, really into that topic, because it was a early limiting factor in my toolbox as a coach. But my point with this story is we went very linear in building the requirement for him to get to the point where now we could shy away. At least you never completely shy away from strength, but we could drastically reduce the amount of volume and time we're spending on max strength. All we needed was to maintain it, but now we needed to focus on making his central nervous system more efficient at generating rate of force development. Because at that time, too, we're entering a time where now Chris Johnson with Tennessee is coming out, and the dude is fast as hell, could cut like crazy. So I'm like, okay, well, how can we have our 254-pound running back kind of like match up with these guys, right? So we needed to focus more on speed strength. But it was a continuum, and it's so important for coaches to understand that. Don't try to do everything all at once, at least not at that level. Like if it's kids, it's a different story. But at that level, you kind of need to be sequential in your approach. So the reality is most of you guys, strength coaches, it's still going to take a while before the main focus of your off season becomes true speed strength dominant.
Patience.
Yeah, and especially considering that unlike us where we're training year round, the pro athlete only really, really trains during the off season. During the in season, it's mostly maintenance work because they have practice time, running drills, games, injuries, whatever, right? So it's limited on how much you can develop in season.
So now we're going to take a look at some of the specialty techniques for explosive strength, starting strength, and reactive strength. We'll start with explosive strength.
Boric, want to take over?
So the first one, the heaviest explosive strength one, which is the easiest starting point, is Olympic lifting. It can be done at a variety of different percentages of 1RM, but generally 60 to 80% is sort of the sweet spot for Olympic lifting. And you can push Olympic lifts as high as 80% and still get an explosive strength training effect because of at some stage there's a displacement of the barbell. So there's you're not in a fixed movement pattern. You're pulling, you're going through triple extension, and the barbell then leaves, I don't know how to describe that, but like it leaves your body. It's
almost as if you're jumping the barbell.
You're jumping or throwing the barbell at some point, so you're not limited by needing to decelerate at any stage throughout the concentric movement under massive load.
And when you're saying Olympic lifts, you're also saying like Olympic lift variations.
Yeah. So it's, and then like if Olympic lifts so dependent on your skill level, because like say if someone's really skilled, they could be doing their like a power snatch with heavier loads, but a lot of the time, like if you're giving someone a power snatch, there's a good chance it's not between a 60 and 80% of their actual snatch because they're not skilled enough. But that is the heaviest specialty technique, quote unquote, for explosive strength. Then after that, we'll move to accommodating resistance, which is a combination of chains, bands, and speed device. When we're talking about, I'm assuming we're bringing up speed device.
Yeah.
Speed device we sometimes talk about, sometimes don't.
Because they don't really exist.
Yeah. So, but chains and bands are the two most popular ones. Chains are slightly easier on the athlete's perspective, whereas bands create greater eccentric forces because you're getting pulled into the eccentric due to the elastic tension within the band, and then during the concentric it's an exponential rise in force requirements, whereas chains are very linear rise in force requirements. So for every 3 inches you move a chain, it increases by the same total load each time. So say it's by 3 pounds for every 3 inches, you know it's going to keep going like that there. But for bands, it could be 3x that. Yeah. So like the first 3 inches is 3 pounds, the next 3 inches could be 9 pounds, and it's exponential in nature. So there's an awful lot greater increase in the demands of the force output throughout the concentric motion, and greater demands in the eccentric, because you're getting pulled with greater force from that top range motion position into your eccentric. So for speed strength purposes, most accommodating resistance is better. It's normally best trained between 50 and 60% of your 1RM of barbell load, and then accommodating resistant load, 20% is generally the sweet spot, but doesn't mean you can't go a little lighter or a little heavier. But 20% is most people's sweet spot. So that's going to put them at the top of the range of motion. It's going to be anywhere from 50 to 80% of their 1RM, which is normally perfect. This is going to allow them to develop force for a longer period of time throughout the concentric action and not spend as much time decelerating the weight. Because the problem is, if you just did 50% barbell on a bench press, you accelerate for 50%, you probably accelerate for the first third of the movement, and then the next 2/3, or at least the last half of the movement, you'll spend decelerating that barbell as a protective mechanism against your joints. Whereas accommodating resistance allows you to keep producing force for more and more of that range of motion, due to the extra force demands being placed on the body by the accommodating resistance matching the strength curve of the exercise.
One thing that I've heard you guys say for explosive strength that we often talk about as well is IMCA, intended maximal concentric acceleration. So is this just kind of like an intro to explosive strength?
Yes. Like you're not going to develop massively high levels of explosive strength just using IMCA, but it could be a really, really good first introduction. And then that there you'll generally do between 70 and 80%. So it's heavy enough that you're not spending a lot of time decelerating, but it's also light enough that you can create a lot of acceleration. And then that'll be done for sub-maximal reps. So 70 to 80% probably for 4 to 6 reps is going to be your sweet spot. And like obviously the heavier, so if you're on the 80% side, you'd be on the lower side of the reps. If you're on the 70% side, it'd be on the higher side of the reps.
The cool thing about IMCA is you need to look at it more as a maximal strength tool that's going to bridge towards your ability to be more efficient at power training. So whenever you're training heavy weights, so 80% plus, and you try to have your concentric action as fast, with the intent of accelerating that concentric action as fast as possible, irrespective of the speed, because the actual speed on the bar will be relatively slow because there's so much weight. But if you try to accelerate, research has shown that because you're teaching the brain to recruit more motor units early to displace the load, and because you're attempting to go fast, you tend to bypass and recruit higher threshold motor units. Then what happens when you move away from max strength and transition to power training using speed strength modalities, now you've already developed the skill to recruit higher threshold motor unit that now you can train at higher speeds. And in fact, I think it's 2012, that study, but because David Bem did it in 96, but they did more research later on. But in 2012, they actually showed, they took a group lifting normal speed. They took a group lifting with IMCA, so the intent of acceleration. They did max strength for 8 weeks or 9 weeks. Then they went to power training at 60% of 1RM. And the group that did IMCA actually had 37% more power output in watts than the group who did not do IMCA. So that's why I'm saying it's a really cool bridge towards power training. So that's why in our education on primary compound movement, we all, in the context of strength, we always promote IMCA because it just teaches all those skills.
Do you even IMCA?
Yeah. We have a whole T-shirt.
And then also under explosive strength, do you also have med ball throws?
Yeah, so
exercises like
anything
that?
ballistic. So when ballistic with a counter movement is a better way of putting that. So ballistic is just when the object is released instead of held at the end. So it could be a throw or it could be a jump.
Okay.
And generally, if we're talking jumps for explosive strength, they're going to be a loaded jump, just to be in their somewhat the right force development needs. But yeah, so as long as there is a preload eccentric and then a release of the object, that would what we consider a ballistic for explosive strength. And that's going to be on the lighter end compared to any of the accommodating resistance or stuff like that.
But when you're training, when you're training regular folks that just wants to train power for gym power, accommodating resistance is great. It's probably my favorite tool. But if you're training athletes, you need to get to the point where you're entering the ballistic world, because that would actually be the holy grail of explosive strength with the athlete, because of the fact that now you're teaching the trainee to accelerate through the entire concentric action, which is what's needed in sport. Because even with the accommodating resistance, although it delays the deceleration, some studies estimated that you're accelerating up to about 80% of the range, but you're still decelerating the last 20%. So eventually you need to do ballistic to really learn that skill so it can transfer to sporting actions better.
Yeah, and one of the reasons that we really like output for our training of power and speed strength is that you can wear it on your wrist or on your foot and still get a power measurement from your ballistic work, which is not typical of a lot of the devices.
Okay, so specialty techniques for developing explosive strength. We had IMCA, Olympic lifts, accommodating resistance, and ballistic methods. And now we'll move on to specialty techniques for developing starting strength.
Yeah, so starting strength, the problem with this is there's not much you can do, because whatever you do needs to be from a dead stop, and it needs to be concentric only at light load. So basically, we have 4 methods we use that are all like one method in a way. Okay, so we have light inertia plus bands. We have light inertia plus ballistic. We have light dead stop plus bands, and we have heavy dead stop plus ballistic. So all that is if you're doing light inertia plus bands, is you're doing, let's say, a typical inertia squat where you're starting from the pins. So the barbell is resting on the pins, adjusted whatever range of motion you want. So let's say mid-range, okay? And then you're pausing 2 seconds. You have tension in your body, tension on the bar. You're pausing 2 seconds, 1, 2, then pow, you try to accelerate. Then come back down, pause, 1, 2, accelerate. So what that inertia does is that 2 seconds allows you to erase about 50% of the kinetic energy you're building during the eccentric. So your concentric action is only using 50% of kinetic energy. But the reason why you need bands is because you're using such light load, like 20% of 1 RM, that if you don't have bands, your joints are going to explode. So you need the band just to act as a buffer at end range. Or you do it ballistically, where now you're doing that inertia squat with the barbell, but you jump. Okay, so that's even better. Okay, and then the dead stop, it's the same thing, but the only difference between inertia and dead stop is dead stop, it's a 4-second pause to erase 100% of kinetic energy. So it's a true concentric action unassisted. And you relax the body during that 4 seconds. So now you're teaching the brain or the trainee to go from a true 0 to 100, from relaxation to activation in a flash, which is the case with linemen, for example, where they're just like standing, observing them. Oh, pow, they need to explode. Okay, so these are basically the only things you can do when it comes to starting strength.
And I think you just misspoke because you said heavy dead stop plus ballistic, but it's still light dead stop plus ballistic.
Starting strength is always light. Now, heavy inertia and heavy dead stop, which is still a static overcome by dynamic technique, those are maximal strength methods. Yeah. They're not speed strength methods.
Yeah. And then finally, specialty techniques for developing reactive strength.
Which is basically plyometrics, and then you have all your scales of plyometrics from intensive, extensive. So like it could be something as simple as pogos, stuff like that there for very extensive, that very low amplitude and you're getting a lot of reps in. Or it could be very, very, very intensive and be like depth jumps. So dropping from a 36-inch box, absorbing and displacing your body as much as possible to try and really emphasize that stretch shortening cycle. But it's far more advanced, far more intensive. So your volume's going to be much less, and you have to have a much greater training age to really benefit from something like that. But anything in between those two could be considered a plyometric for reactive strength.
Then you need to consider unilateral, bilateral, vertical displacement, horizontal displacement, depending on the sport, the athlete, and on and on. But the thing is, reactive strength. So let's say you're assessing the athlete, and the athlete showcases weakness in reactive strength, but the athlete is still somewhat not at maximal strength standards. You might be better off still focusing on explosive strength, but you should still, with athletes, train reactive strength during the entire at least GPP, SPP at least, via a dynamic warm-up. So the dynamic warm-up with these athletes could be plyometric progressions. So you're actually building a base, a progressive base of reactive strength while you're attacking the bigger limiting factor.
And I know we've talked about it before too, where it's something that you can be doing these plyos as part of your warm-up, like you said, but even if you're in those phases still working with that athlete on hypertrophy or maximal strength, they can still be going through at least that plyo warm-up.
Because in the end of the day, no matter what, you have to prepare an athlete for the demands of the sport. And if they've done no level of plyometric activity before going into a season, then expected to go out and run and do all the conditioning activities, they're a bigger risk factor than from not doing plyometrics than introducing plyometrics too soon. So you just have to scale the plyometrics to where the athlete currently is in their demands.
It's just you have to be clever at the middle ground of it is very important, because let's say you're training a NHL hockey player with a relatively short off season, and during their off season they're skating a decent amount of time, and then they go to the preseason. So usually it's like late August, early September. They have preseason because the season starts early October. Well, at that point, they're going to do a lot of skating, right? So if you're training them during that time, and on top of all of their skating and high velocity, in the weight room, you actually have 2 full days dedicated to plyo only, then it's overkill. Okay, so you just have to be careful at knowing when to do higher volumes of plyo, how much they need, but then making sure that before you do high volumes or high frequency, high intensity plyo, you've built a base. That's why we like that dynamic plyo warm-up routine, because it builds the base. Even if reactive strength is not that specific athlete's priority, you're still building a base so that by the time they're moving away from the private sector, so they're moving away from you and going with their team, they'll be ready to cope with the rigors of the preseason.
Yeah. And while this isn't always true, it's definitely something I've observed a lot of, is people are generally undertrained in extensive plyometrics and overtrained in intensive plyometrics, and not in terms of they're getting overtrained by doing it, is they've spent too much time doing intensive and not enough time doing extensive. So they're just leaving too much on the table by not building their base with the extensive first.
Yeah, and the connective tissue sometimes is not ready.
Exactly.
And then something snaps when you're doing intensive.
Yeah.
There's definitely a lot of information on speed strength. We do have a power specialization course on trainkilo.com. So I just want you to quickly explain the power specialization course in terms of how coaches can apply it, because I know we specifically say this is power in the weight room.
Yeah, so that's a cool, important nuance. So the Power Specialization course is for those of you trainers and coaches that are training non-athletes or retired athletes that are looking to get some of the benefits of power training through their yearly periodization plan. So if you have people interested in developing power, which I would suggest anyone to do because it's so good, this would be the course for you. If you're talking about the athletic population, then the sports performance seminar would be more applicable for you guys, because the application and mostly the periodization is completely different.
Yeah, but pretty much everything we talked about today was more so the specialty technique
course. Yeah, so if you really wanted to take a look at all of the specialty techniques we discussed in this episode, because I know that was kind of a short part of the episode in the end, our specialty technique course has over 50 specialty techniques. We show
60.
Over 60 specialty techniques. We show you how to do it. We go over how to apply it in the weight room and everything in between. That's definitely been a really good resource for our coaches, because we refer to the specialty techniques in multiple of our courses, so that's kind of like the one-stop shop of everything specialty techniques.
And the resource for it is huge.
That's true.
Thanks for tuning in. Remember to drop your questions at the link below. See you next week.